I mean, out of all the reasons that you're running for president, I mean, what are the main ones? What do you really hope to do?
I mean, well, you know, one of the reasons that this happened, you know, one of the reasons that inspired me to run was I see this chronic disease epidemic in our country. And we had, when my uncle was president, 6% of Americans had chronic disease. And today, and then by 1986, 11.8 had chronic disease. By 2006, 54% of kids had chronic disease. And we don't know what it is today because at that point, NIH stopped publishing the data. They do not want us to see this happening. And to me, it's the biggest thing that's happening right now. The cost of healthcare in this country, the cost of the military, you know, was supposed to go down to $200 billion a year after the wall came down in 1992. We were promised a peace dividend. It's now $1.3 trillion a year. But the cost of healthcare is $4.3 trillion, and 93% of that is chronic disease. These are new diseases, mostly. So by chronic disease, there's basically 4 categories. There's obesity. When my uncle was president, 6% of American kids were obese. Today, 42%, and 75 are overweight. American kids did not suddenly become lazy. They're being poisoned, mass poisoned, and by something. And we're all being lied to about it. And then neurological diseases, all these diseases that suddenly appeared in the early 90s. ADD, ADHD, speech delay, language delay, tics, Tourette syndrome, narcolepsy, ASD, autism. None of us ever heard of these diseases when I was a kid. I worked at the dead center of the battle for rights for people with intellectual disabilities. My aunt, Eunice Shriver, started Special Olympics. I was working in it as a hugger and as a coach from when I was 8 years old. I worked for 200 hours in Wassaic Home for the Retarded when I was in high school because of that. This was part of our family DNA. And I never saw a kid with autism, full-blown autism. The CDC's data say that in my generation, today, right now, autism in 69-year-old men, 1 in 10,000. And in my children's generation, 1 in 34. So what happened? Well, Congress said to EPA, what year did the autism epidemic begin? EPA is a captive agency. It's captive by the oil industry, the coal industry, and the pesticide industry, but it's not captive by pharma because it doesn't regulate pharma. So they actually did a real study. And they came back and said 1989, it's a red line. That is the year the epidemic started. Well, a lot of other chronic disease epidemics started at that time as well. Allergies. I had 11 siblings, 70 cousins. I never knew anybody with a peanut allergy. Nobody prior to 89 heard of peanut allergies. And now there's EpiPens in every classroom. What happened? Something happened in 1989. And then eczema, nobody ever heard of eczema when I was a kid. Now it's everywhere. All these allergic diseases, anaphylaxis, asthma. My brother had asthma. He was told by his doctor that there will never be a cure for asthma because it's so rare nobody will ever study it. Well, today, 1 out of every black kid in an urban area has asthma. And then the autoimmune disease, 120 autoimmune diseases that we never heard of, you know, juvenile diabetes, lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, Crohn's disease, all of this stuff that nobody ever heard of, and suddenly it's everywhere. And why is nobody asking, where is it coming from? So the pharma is, of course, making money on it. That $4.3 trillion, the 93% of that goes for $600 EpiPens, albuterol inhalers, anti-seizure medications, insulin syringes. They're cashing in on it. And NIH right now, instead of doing science and asking the one question they should be asking, Where's it coming from? Instead, they have changed the purpose of that agency to become an incubator for new pharmaceutical drugs, which they keep half of. So the Moderna vaccine, NIH owns half that vaccine. They get half the royalties. They're making tens of billions of dollars on it. And there are 6 individuals at NIH who have margin rights to the patent, who are each collecting $150,000 a year forever from that vaccine. And so these naturally, the mercantile ambitions of the individuals and the agency subsume the regulatory function of those agencies. And I'm going to end that. And I'm going to go over there during the first week. I'm going to go over to Bethesda my first week in office, and I'm going to get all of the big wigs from NIH together, and I'm going to say, you know, NIH gives away $42 billion a year, and it gives it to 56,000 scientists or universities all over the country, and what they're doing now is mainly developing pharmaceutical drugs to treat the chronic disease epidemic. And if anybody tries to study, well, where is it coming from? They get a threat from NIH. Do not study that. And NIH can bankrupt their college. NIH can bankrupt any medical school in the country simply by not giving the $300 million a year that medical school is getting every year from NIH to study cures and treatments for chronic disease. So I'm going to go down there and I'm going to say we're going to give infectious disease a break and drug development a break. And we're going to, for the next 8 years, we're going to figure out where's the chronic, why are our kids the sickest kids in the world? Why do we have the highest chronic disease burden of any country in the world? Why do we have the highest 4 times, highest healthcare costs in the world and the worst outcomes? Why are we 79th in the world behind Mongolia, Cuba, Nicaragua, Costa Rica in healthcare? Why? Why did we have the highest body count from COVID on Earth? We had 16% of the COVID deaths in this country. We only have 4.2% of the global population. Why? Well, CDC said part of it is just mismanagement. The other part is we have the highest chronic disease rate burden, and COVID was killing people with CDC said the average American who died from chronic disease, from COVID, had 3.8 chronic diseases. So they had diabetes, they had asthma, they had obesity, and one more. That's what was killing people. It was not COVID. COVID pushed them off the cliff, but the chronic disease got them to the top of the cliff with 1 foot over. So I'm going to go down there. And I'm going to say, we're going to identify, I'll just shut up,
we can go a little bit more if you want.
There's a famous toxicologist in New York named Phil Landrigan, and I have used him on many, many cases. He's a genius, and he's very careful now about hanging out with me because, you know, the association could hurt his reputation. But Phil Landrigan has done a series of studies to say, yeah, something happened in 1989. And what could it be? You need to find, we know it's not genes. Genes don't cause epidemics. The genes can provide a vulnerability, but you need an environmental toxin. So what was it? What environmental toxins are there that are in the category of suspects that became ubiquitous around 1989? That affected every demographic from Cubans in Key Biscayne, Miami to Inuit in Alaska, and that impact boys on neurological injuries at a 4-to-1 ratio to girls. What is there that could be that? And he's come on with about 13 or 14 things that it could possibly be. One of those is glyphosate from Roundup. That fits that timeline perfectly. Another is atrazine, which is another pesticide, which is now in 63% of the water systems in the country, neonicotinoid pesticides. Same thing. PFOAs and PFASs, the forever chemicals that were put around that timeline in all of our furniture and all of our children's pajamas. They're flame retardants. Wi-Fi radiation from cell phones, ultrasound radiation. Some of these things, to me, are not suspects, but they have to be treated as suspects so we can eliminate them. High fructose corn syrup, which clearly is part of the explanation for the obesity and the diabetes epidemic. So there's a small universe, and we have all the data we need already to figure out who's doing it. And what I'll do is I'll go down there and say, that's what we're going to do. And we're going to find out. And then the vaccine schedule, which went in 1989, we went from 3 vaccines to 72 vaccines. 3 vaccines I got as a kid. My kids got 72, mandated. So, and the big change here was 1989. So that has to be a suspect too. So it's probably all of them, or a large part of them. Our kids are now swimming around in a toxic soup, and they're getting all of these exposures that operate along the same biological pathways, and they're probably cumulative. But let's find out, and then let's eliminate them. And you can say to me, well, even if you find out it's high fructose corn syrup, by the way, if you drink Coca-Cola, you should drink Mexican Coke and not, this stuff, the high fructose. If let's say we find out it's high fructose corn syrup, what can you do about it? There's a million farmers who are tied in that industry. There's big industrial BMS like Cargill and Monsanto and these huge players. You can never change it, but you can. The same way that we did with Roundup. We got Roundup taken out of all home gardening because once there's a certain critical mass of science, you can get past this threshold in the courts called the Daubert threshold, where you're allowed to take that case to a jury. If there's about 15 studies that say the same thing, you have animal studies, bench studies, human studies. They all say, at some point the judge will say, yeah, you can take this case to a jury. There's enough, well, I'm gonna create the science. And at that point, you don't need to change the regulations because the plaintiff's bar will go out there and vindicate that product and get it off the market for that purpose. So anyway, that's the long answer to your question.